Later that evening, Mira unpacked her meager belongings in her assigned quarters. The room automatically adjusted its environmental settings, compensating for what the system designated as her extreme biological requirements. The air pressure shifted, humidity levels rose, and the lighting dimmed to what the Academy considered a safe level for fragile retinal structures. "You may disable the safety protocols if you wish," announced the room's interface, though medical services strongly advises against it. Mira sighed. "Earth standard settings, please. I promise I won't melt." A hesitation in the system, then compliance. The room brightened to what actually felt comfortable, and the cloying humidity dissipated. She pulled out her old textbooks, physical books that had raised eyebrows at customs, and arranged them on the shelf. Her fingers traced the worn cover of her calculus text, remembering how she'd struggled through it back in Seattle. A gentle chime indicated someone at her door. Outside stood Clara, her crystalline form catching the corridor lights in prismatic patterns. "Human student Mira," Clara began formally, "our team has decided to begin preliminary work on the assignment. Your presence is requested if convenient." "Just Mira is fine," she replied, following the Lumidian down the curved hallway. "And thanks for including me." Clara's crystalline structure shifted in what might have been embarrassment. "It is the protocol for group assignments. Though Zixtal suggested your participation might be educational for you." "I'm sure it will be," Mira said, hiding a smile. The study room had transformed in her absence. Holographic projections filled the air, data streams flowing between them. Dorn floated in his containment field, appendages moving through complex patterns that manipulated the displays. Zixtal sat at the center, neural pathways visibly firing as calculations formed and dissolved around him. "Ah, the human arrives," Zixtal noted without looking up. "We've begun preliminary analysis of your planet's atmospheric mechanics. Fascinating but primitive system. The chaotic variables will require straightforward matrix solutions." Mira took a seat at the edge of the work area. "What approach are you using?" "Standard Cerebrian decomposition," Zixtal replied, slightly surprised by the question. "We'll isolate each variable set, solve the deterministic equations, then reintegrate the solution matrices." Dorn's translator emitted a burst of methane language before converting to standard speech. "Your world's tendency toward random fluctuation presents an interesting puzzle. But the patterns, once identified, should yield to statistical normalization." Mira nodded, watching as they constructed increasingly complex mathematical structures in the air. Their approach was elegant, precise, and completely unsuited to Earth's weather systems. She'd seen the same beautiful, doomed methodology in her first-year meteorology class. "Would it be helpful if I explained how we approach these problems on Earth?" she offered. The three aliens exchanged glances. "Perhaps later," Clara said kindly. "First, we should demonstrate proper methodologies." "Of course," Mira replied, pulling out her tablet. "I'll just work on some notes over here." As her teammates dove deeper into their elaborate solutions, Mira quietly began her own approach. She sketched out rough approximation models, probability cones, and the iterative testing frameworks her meteorology professor had drilled into her. The methods looked crude next to the aliens' mathematical artistry, but Mira knew something they didn't. Earth's weather had humbled far more sophisticated approaches than theirs. She glanced up as Zixtal's first model collapsed under its own complexity, the holographic display shattering into fragments of failed equations. It had begun. By the next morning, the study room had become a monument to failed methodologies. Holographic debris lit up the virtual workspace, abandoned equations, collapsed prediction models, and fragmented datasets. Zixtal hadn't moved in 3 hours, his neural pathways pulsing with increasingly erratic patterns as he attempted his 14th complete mathematical restructuring. "The variables refuse logical correlation," he muttered, more to himself than his teammates. "Atmospheric density affects temperature, which affects pressure, which affects density again. It's circular." Kalara's crystalline form had dimmed considerably for exhaustion. Perhaps we should consult the Nexus Library archives. Surely someone has created a functional model for chaotic planetary systems before. Mira stretched in her corner, rolling her stiff neck. She'd been quietly working through her own approach, occasionally glancing up to watch her teammates' increasing frustration with a mixture of sympathy and amusement. The door hissed open, admitting a delegation of Vex-Harry mathematicians, their silvery exoskeletons clicking as they entered. The species was renowned for solving the 11-dimensional equations that made interstellar travel possible. "We received notification of an interesting problem," their leader announced, compound eyes taking in the chaos of the room. "The Academy Director granted us temporary access to assist. Less computationally advanced species." Dorn's methane bubble clouded briefly with what might have been indignation. "The problem isn't computational power. Earth's atmosphere exhibits properties that defy standard analytical frameworks." The lead Vex-Harry made a dismissive gesture with one forelimb. "All physical systems yield to proper mathematical treatment. Show us the parameters." Zixtal reluctantly transferred his work to the central display. The Vex-Harry clustered around it, their exoskeletons shifting through colors that represented their computational processes. Their confidence lasted exactly 7 minutes. "This is nonsensical," declared their leader, mandibles clicking in agitation. "These readings contradict established turbulence principles. The historical data must be corrupted." "It's not corrupted," Mira said, speaking up for the first time. All eyes turned to her. "Earth's weather systems are genuinely this unpredictable. That's why we use probabilistic models instead of deterministic ones." The lead Vex-Harry's antennae stiffened in what might have been offense. "Probability is a crutch for incomplete understanding. True science demands precision." "Earth's weather doesn't care what true science demands," Mira replied with a shrug. "It does what it wants anyway." The Vex-Harry delegation departed in frosty silence, their academic pride visibly wounded. They were the third group to visit and leave that day. Kalara drifted over to where Mira sat surrounded by her notes. "You don't seem surprised by these difficulties." "I'm not," Mira admitted. "Weather forecasting is notoriously difficult on Earth. Even our most advanced supercomputers can only predict with reasonable accuracy about 10 days out." 10 days? Zixtal looked up, his neural crest pulsing with disbelief. "Your species accepts such limitations." "We don't just accept them. We expect them," Mira explained. "Perfect prediction of chaotic systems isn't possible. We work with probability ranges instead." "But how do you plan anything?" Dorn asked, genuine confusion in his translator's output. "We adapt," Mira said simply. "We bring umbrellas just in case. We check forecasts knowing they might be wrong. We build margins of error into everything." Her 3 teammates exchanged troubled glances, confronting a concept more alien than any life form they'd encountered, planning around inevitable uncertainty rather than eliminating it. "Show us," Kalara finally said, her crystalline form brightening with reluctant curiosity. Grand Scholar Velox slipped away from the growing commotion in the symposium hall, his 8 limbs moving with surprising grace for his age. He found Mira sitting cross-legged on the floor of a quiet alcove, surrounded by her notes and sketches. "Your approach seems remarkably analog," he observed, gesturing toward her physical papers with a tentacle. Mira looked up, hastily rising to her feet. "Grand Scholar, I didn't expect. It's an honor, sir." "Please, continue your work," Velox said, settling his bulk onto a conforming cushion. "I find myself curious about your methodology. While the greatest minds in the galaxy attempt increasingly complex solutions, you work with simple tools and appear unconcerned." Mira hesitated, then sat back down. "It's not that I'm unconcerned. It's just that I've been taught not to expect perfect solutions for problems like this." "Explain," Velox said, his primary eyes focusing intently while the secondary set monitored the chaos in the main hall. "Earth's weather is a chaotic system with too many variables to track perfectly," Mira began, warming to her subject. "Instead of trying to create perfect predictions, we create useful ones, models that acknowledge their limitations but still provide actionable information." Velox's skin rippled in what might have been discomfort. "You design systems expecting them to be wrong." "We design systems expecting reality to be messier than our models," Mira corrected gently. "There's a difference." The Grand Scholar's secondary eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep thought among his species. Most advanced civilizations evolved on worlds with more predictable environments. Precise calculations served their survival needs. But your species, we had to make quick decisions with incomplete information, Mira finished. Predators don't wait while you gather more data. Storms don't hold off until you've perfected your models. Through the archway, they could see a delegation of hive-mind mathematicians, their synchronized movements indicating shared calculation processes, staring in frustration at fragmenting projection models. "This assignment has caused quite a stir," Velox noted. "The Cerebrian Mathematical Council has formally requested access to our computational arrays. The Vex-Harry academics have suggested the problem might be culturally biased, a serious accusation." "It's just a weather prediction model," Mira said, surprised. "Every meteorology student on Earth works with similar problems." Velox's primary eyes widened. "Students? This is considered educational material for juvenile humans." "Well, advanced high school or undergraduate level," Mira clarified. "It's challenging, but not exceptionally so." A commotion from the main hall drew their attention. The projection of a transcended intelligence, one of the few species that had evolved beyond physical form into pure computational existence, had appeared above the central platform. Its shifting patterns indicated it was applying its vast processing power to the problem. "Even the transcended are taking an interest," Velox murmured. "Unprecedented." "They might be overthinking it," Mira suggested. "Sometimes simpler approaches work better for complex systems." Velox turned his primary eyes back to her. "Perhaps it is time we learned more about these simpler approaches. The assignment deadline is approaching, and despite the combined intellectual might of the galaxy's greatest minds, we have no working solution." He gestured toward her notes. "Would you be willing to explain your methodology to the Assembly? Not as a student, but as a representative of Earth's unique problem-solving tradition." Mira blinked in surprise. "Me? Teaching the galaxy's greatest minds?" "Sometimes," Velox said with surprising humility, "the greatest minds need the greatest teachers." "Show us? You mean you want me to explain my methodology?" Mira asked, both surprised and wary. After hours of watching her teammates' increasingly complex approaches fail, their sudden interest in her primitive method seemed suspicious. Not explain. Demonstrate, Zixtal clarified, his neural crest pulsing with reluctant curiosity. We have observed 17 distinct species attempt this problem. All have failed using established mathematical frameworks. Mira glanced at her notes, then at the holographic debris of failed models floating above them. Okay, but I need to clear all this first. It's distracting. With a gesture from Kilara, the projected equations vanished, leaving an empty workspace. Mira stood, hesitating briefly before plugging her tablet into the room's projection system. Our simple diagrams appeared, looking almost childish compared to the sophisticated constructs that had filled the space moments before. First, we accept that perfect prediction is impossible, she began, highlighting a section of her notes. Earth's atmosphere has too many interacting variables, feedback loops, and chaotic elements. Accepting failure before beginning seems counterproductive, Dorn commented, methane swirling in his containment bubble. It's not accepting failure, it's defining realistic success, Mira countered. Instead of asking, will it rain on Tuesday? We ask, what's the probability of rain on Tuesday? We use ranges instead of points, probabilities instead of certainties. She projected a series of overlapping cones extending from a central point. This is a probability cone. Instead of one prediction, we run thousands of slightly different models with tiny variations in starting conditions. Where they cluster tells us the most likely outcomes. Kilara's crystalline structure shifted in what might have been discomfort. But this means many of your projections will be wrong. All models are wrong, Mira said simply. Some are useful. We're aiming for useful. She demonstrated how her approach built in error ranges, confidence intervals, and adaptive testing. As she worked, her alien teammates watched with expressions ranging from confusion to fascination. This approach, Zixtal said slowly, seems to require accepting fundamental uncertainty as a premise rather than a failure. Exactly. Mira nodded enthusiastically. Weather forecasters on Earth don't just predict weather, they assess and communicate uncertainty. A 60% chance of rain means you should probably bring an umbrella, not that it will definitely rain. Dorn's translator emitted a series of puzzled clicks. But how do planners function without certainty? How do you build infrastructure without knowing exact conditions? We build in safety margins, Mira explained. Bridges that can handle more weight than expected. Buildings that can withstand stronger winds than predicted. We prepare for worst-case scenarios while planning for the most likely ones. The three aliens exchanged troubled glances, centuries of educational programming conflicting with the evidence before them. Their perfect models had failed. Mira's imperfect one was progressing. There is elegance in this approach, Kilara admitted, her crystalline form reflecting Mira's projections in fractured patterns. It acknowledges the limitations of knowledge rather than pretending they don't exist. Zixtal's neural pathways visibly shifted, forming new connections. On my world, approximation is viewed as intellectual laziness. But perhaps in some contexts, it represents intellectual honesty. Mira smiled, feeling a small bridge forming between their vastly different cognitive approaches. Exactly. We can't know everything, so we work with what we know while acknowledging what we don't. It's not about being perfect, it's about being good enough to be useful. Good enough to be useful, Dorn repeated, the phrase clearly alien to his thought patterns. A strangely compelling concept. A profound silence gripped the Grand Assembly chamber as Mira's model rotated in the projection field. The visual representation of Earth's weather patterns flowed and shifted, probability gradients represented by varying shades of blue and green. As you can see, Mira continued, trying to keep her voice steady, the model doesn't attempt to predict exact conditions at exact points. Instead, it generates probability fields with confidence levels indicated by color intensity. A Lumidian elder rose from the front row, her crystalline form glowing with age and accumulated knowledge. Student Chen, you reference acceptable error margins throughout your model. By what methodology did you determine what errors are acceptable? Mira took a deep breath. This was the crux of what they didn't understand. The acceptable error margin depends on the model's purpose. For evacuation planning during severe weather, we need higher certainty than for deciding whether to hold an outdoor concert. The model adjusts its precision requirements based on the stakes of the decision being made. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The concept of variable precision standards seemed genuinely revolutionary to many present. But this renders the model subjective, protested the Cerebrian delegate, mathematical symbols flashing across his neural crest in agitation. Truly rigorous science must be objective. With respect, Mira replied, the universe doesn't care about our standards of rigor. Complex chaotic systems like Earth's atmosphere don't become more predictable just because we want them to be. Acknowledging the limits of prediction isn't subjective, it's realistic. Grand Scholar Velox moved forward, his appendages gesturing for calm. The human student raises an interesting philosophical point. Perhaps what we perceive as a limitation might actually be a different type of approach entirely. A holographic projection of the transcended intelligence manifested above the central platform, its patterns shifting in what their species used for communication. The translation projected below. We have analyzed the human methodology. It represents a cognitive adaptation to environmental chaos. Species evolving on more stable worlds never developed this approach because they never needed it. Mira caught Zixtal's eye from across the chamber. Her teammate nodded slightly, his neural crest pulsing with what might have been newfound respect. The most profound aspect, continued the transcended intelligence, is not the technical methodology, but the philosophical premise. Acceptance of inherent uncertainty as a starting point rather than a failure state. This perspective allows for useful action despite incomplete information, a significant evolutionary advantage in unstable environments. Professor Thaxis stepped forward nervously. If I may, the implications extend beyond weather prediction. Many of the galaxy's most challenging problems, quantum gravity reconciliation, consciousness transference, even interspecies translation, involve similar levels of inherent uncertainty and complexity. The assembly erupted in multiple languages, translators struggling to keep pace with the conceptual debates. Mira stood quietly at the center, somewhat amazed that her homework assignment had sparked a galactic philosophical crisis. The Grand Scholar raised his primary appendages for silence. Student Chen, your model accepts that it will sometimes be wrong. How does your species handle the consequences of incorrect predictions? We adapt, Mira replied simply. We build resilience into our systems. We create contingency plans. We learn from mistakes and improve our models. Perfect prediction isn't possible, but continuous improvement is. As the words left her mouth, Mira realized she was describing not just weather forecasting, but the entire human approach to existence. A philosophy forged by surviving on a world that never stopped challenging them. Judging by the stunned silence in the chamber, the assembled academics were realizing it too. Professor Thaxis adjusted the environmental controls in the newly designated Terrestrial Cognitive Studies Laboratory, carefully calibrating them to Earth standard conditions. Holographic representations of human neural structures floated beside examples from 47 other sentient species. The physical evidence is undeniable. He explained to the gathered researchers their diverse physiologies requiring a patchwork of environmental bubbles around the room. Human brains show significant development in regions associated with pattern approximation, error correction, and adaptive decision-making. He gestured to comparative scans. Most spacefaring species show evolutionary emphasis on precision centers, especially those from stable environments. Humans, by contrast, evolved robust systems for making functional decisions with incomplete information. A Vex-Harry researcher raised an appendage, but surely technological advancement requires precision. How did humans develop spaceflight with such approximative thinking? An excellent question, Faxes replied, projecting historical images of early human space disasters. Human technological development wasn't linear or clean. It involved extensive trial and error, sometimes with tragic consequences. But they persisted, learning from each failure and building increasingly sophisticated approximation models. In the adjacent amphitheater, Mira sat at a table with 5 other human exchange students hastily recruited for across the academy. Before them stood a delegation of quantum computing specialists, their frustration evident despite their artificial bodies' limited expressiveness. "But how do you know when to stop refining an approximation?" demanded their leader, optical sensors flaring. "Without objective standards, the stopping point seems arbitrary." "We use pragmatic criteria," answered Sanjay, a human engineering student from Mumbai. "When further refinement costs more than the benefits it provides, we stop." "Cost-benefit analysis is subjective," protested the quantum specialist. "Exactly," Mira interjected. "That's the point. Complex decisions require subjective judgment. We embrace that rather than pretending it doesn't exist." The human panel found themselves explaining concepts that had never required explanation on Earth. Good enough, diminishing returns, educated guesses, rule of thumb. Concepts so fundamental to human thinking they were nearly invisible to those who used them. Meanwhile, in the experimental laboratory, Zixtal worked alongside Clara and Dorn, their original study group now expanded into an official research team. They had applied Mira's methodology to a series of previously unsolvable problems, with surprisingly effective results. The approach functions beyond weather prediction, Clara noted, her crystalline form reflecting cascading data streams. "We've achieved workable solutions for quantum fluctuation mapping, stellar evolution projections, and even linguistic drift prediction." Zixtal's neurocrest pulsed with excitement. "The key insight isn't the specific mathematics, it's the philosophical foundation. By accepting uncertainty as fundamental rather than as failure, we open entirely new solution spaces." Dorn manipulated a holographic representation of a chaotic system, introducing deliberate approximations. "My people have always viewed imprecision as intellectual weakness. We now must consider whether our pursuit of perfect models has actually limited our problem-solving capacity." Across the academy, similar conversations unfolded as species that had evolved in vastly different environments confronted a revolutionary concept. Perhaps perfect understanding wasn't always necessary for effective action. Perhaps the human comfort with uncertainty wasn't primitive thinking, but a sophisticated adaptation to universal complexity. The Galactic Classification Bureau, meeting in emergency session, debated terminology for this cognitive approach. After hours of deliberation, they settled on adaptive approximation methodology, officially recognizing what humans had simply called common sense for millennia. Within weeks, the Academy's curriculum underwent its most significant revision in 3 centuries. New courses appeared alongside traditional precision-based studies, with waiting lists that crashed the registration system twice. Mira found herself assigned a teaching assistant role, a position normally reserved for graduate-level students. Her first lecture session on functional approximation in complex systems drew such a crowd that the room's environmental systems struggled to accommodate the diverse biological requirements. The key principle, she explained to the packed auditorium, isn't about accepting lower standards. It's about matching your methods to your goals and the nature of the problem. A Lumidian student raised a crystalline appendage. But how do you determine which problems require precision and which require approximation? Excellent question, Mira replied. Generally, the more chaotic or complex the system, the more appropriate approximation becomes. Engineering a bridge, precision matters. Predicting social trends, approximation is essential. After class, Zixtal waited by the door, his neural crest pulsing with what Mira had learned to recognize as excitement. The Joint Research Council has approved our proposal, he announced as they walked together toward the laboratory complex. We'll apply your methodology to the quantum gravity reconciliation problem. Mira nearly stumbled. That's one of the galaxy's unsolved grand challenges. They're letting students work on it. Not just students, Zixtal clarified. Our team has been expanded to include specialists from 7 disciplines. But you and I remain core researchers based on our pioneering work. Across campus in the administrative spire, Grand Scholar Velox met with representatives from the Galactic Education Council. The holographic projections of delegates from 32 worlds fill the chamber, their diverse forms unified by common interest. The implications extend far beyond academic curricula, explained the Cerebrian delegate, neural patterns rippling across his skin. We've identified 47 grand challenge problems, previously considered unsolvable, that may yield to these hybrid approaches. The Vortexian representative's methane swirled in agreement. My people have already deployed approximative models to our stellar observation networks. Early results show a 43% improvement in nova prediction accuracy. Velox's primary eyes focused on the data streams, while his secondary set monitored emotional indicators among the delegates. What is most remarkable is that this cognitive approach has apparently existed on Earth for millennia. Humans take it so for granted they rarely formalize or discuss it. In the Academy's central plaza, Kilara conducted an impromptu workshop for a group of eager students from 12 worlds. Her crystalline form projected simplified models, demonstrating iterative improvement techniques. The method allows for continuous refinement, she explained. You begin with crude approximations, test against reality, identify discrepancies, and improve your model. Each iteration brings you closer to functional, though never perfect, prediction. A quantum intelligence student raised an objection. But without certainty, how do you trust your conclusions? Trust is calibrated to context, Kilara answered, surprised by how naturally the human concept now came to her. High-stakes decisions demand higher confidence thresholds. The model tells you not just predictions, but confidence levels for each. Throughout the Academy, similar scenes unfolded as the principles of human approximation methodology spread from department to department. Species that had evolved in dramatically different environments found common ground in this new approach, a recognition that the universe's fundamental uncertainty wasn't a bug but a feature, something to be worked with rather than against. The Academy's grand reopening ceremony drew diplomatic delegations from across the galaxy. The central hall, normally an austere space dominated by traditional disciplinary symbols, now featured an interactive monument dedicated to cognitive diversity. At its heart, a holographic representation of Mira's original homework problem rotated slowly, surrounded by the thousands of solution approaches attempted by different species. Mira stood with her fellow human exchange students, all wearing the blue sashes that had become their unofficial uniform. "I still can't believe they built a monument to a weather prediction model," she whispered to Sanjay. "Not to the model," he corrected. "To the paradigm shift. There's a difference." Across the hall, Mira spotted her original teammates. Kalara's crystalline form now incorporated subtle Earth-inspired patterns, a growing trend among younger Lumidians. Dorn floated in his methane bubble, now modified with what the engineering department called adaptive interface projectors that allowed more nuanced interaction with other species. And Zixtal's neural crest pulsed with both the precise mathematical patterns of his people and the new, more fluid structures representing approximative thinking. Grand Scholar Velox approached the central platform, his ceremonial robes adorned with symbols from 100 worlds. The assembly fell silent. 6 months ago, he began. A simple educational exercise revealed a profound truth about our galactic community. While we had achieved technological marvels and explored the cosmos, we had somehow missed an entire cognitive approach, one evolved by humans in response to their chaotic homeworld. He gestured to the monument. "We initially saw this as a story of human exceptionalism. But the deeper truth is more profound. It is a story of cognitive diversity. Each of our species evolved thinking patterns suited to our native environments. None is universally superior. Each has domains where it excels." Mira felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. A message notification hovered in her personal field. Opening it revealed a communication from her former high school teacher back in Seattle. "Asterisk had just watched your ceremony on the Interstellar feed. Who knew that my assignment would end up in a galactic museum? By the way, I've been asked to consult on adapting human educational methods for 7 different species. Apparently, teaching teenagers to predict chaotic systems is considered revolutionary off-world. Stay amazing, Professor Chen. Asterisk." Mira smiled at the premature title. As the ceremony continued, she reflected on how completely her life had changed. What had started as a simple homework assignment had evolved into a new field of study, one that might help solve problems that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for centuries. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of the Academy's new motto, rendered in the languages of 100 worlds: precision where possible, approximation where necessary, wisdom to know the difference. As the assembly dispersed, Zixtal approached, his neural pathways visibly reconfigured from when they'd first met. "The quantum gravity team has made a breakthrough," he said without preamble. "Using your iterative approximation approach, we've achieved a working unification model. It's not perfect, but..." "Let me guess," Mira interrupted with a smile. "It's good enough to be useful." Exactly. Zixtal's neural crest pulsed with what she now recognized as humor. How very human of us.